Hi, in this video we're going to continue looking at Booleans, and in particular we're going to look at object truth values. Objects have an associated truth value in Python, and in fact all objects have an associated truth value. We saw this in the last video with integers. We saw that, for example, bool of 0 would return false, but bool of 1 would return true, and bool of any integer other than 0 would return true. And we call that truthiness of integers. Now, to be fair, bool is a subclass of int, so we might think that, well, this really is just a special case. It only applies to integers because bool is a subclass of int, so there's a direct relationship between the two. But this actually applies to any object in Python. It works the same way for any object. And now the rules are pretty straightforward to determining whether an object is going to evaluate as truthy or falsy. The default is that objects evaluate to true. They just evaluate to true by default, except in a few cases, which are, well, the none object, the none singleton object, always evaluates to false. The false singleton object also always evaluates to false, which is probably a good thing. 0 in any numeric type, be it int, float, complex, decimal, it doesn't matter. If it's 0, it will evaluate to false. If it's non-zero, it will evaluate to true. But here we're talking about the exceptions. So if it's 0, it will be false. Empty sequences, so things like lists or tuples or strings, if they are empty, if they have no elements, they will be falsy. Same thing with mapping types, things like dictionaries or sets or frozen sets. If they have no elements, then they will also evaluate to false. And then custom classes. When we write our own custom classes, we can also provide a way to determine how to make the truthiness of that class, of that object. And that's done by implementing either the dunderbool method or the dunderlen method. We'll take a look at that in a minute. And if those return false or 0, then the object will be falsy. And so these are the only times when an object will evaluate to false, will have an associated truth value of false. Otherwise, it's going to be true. So let's take a look under the hood a little closer at how this is achieved. So classes define their truth values by defining a special instance method, the bool method. Now, if the bool method isn't found, it can also look at the underscore, the double underscore, dunder len method. So when we call bool of x, where x is an instance of some class, then what's actually happening is that Python is executing x dot dunder bool dunder. So it's trying to execute that method. If that method exists, it will return whatever that method returns. So that's why we said earlier that in general, the way to get our custom object to be falsy is for the bool method to return false. That's exactly how we would do it. Now, if it doesn't find the x underscore underscore bool, so it will execute the len method instead, if bool is not defined. So the first choice, it will try to execute dunder bool. If it doesn't find it, it will try to execute dunder len on the object. And if that still fails, then it's just going to return true. So the default is true, right? So the default truthiness of every object in Python is true unless there is a bool or len method that returns false or 0, in which case it will be false. Now, of course, if bool returns true or len returns something other than 0, then the associated value would be true. So let's take a look at how this might be implemented in the integer class. So the integer class will define a method called dunderbool. And it's an instance method. As you can see, we have this parameter self. And this is all it does. It just returns self not equal to 0. That's the implementation of the dunderbool method for ints. So when we call bool of 100, then Python executes 100 dot dunderbool. It looks at the instance method bool and calls it for this particular instance, which was 100. So it's going to return the result of 100 not equal to 0. It evaluates that. And of course, 100 is not equal to 0, so it will return true. So bool of 100 is true. 100 is truthy. On the other hand, if we call bool of 0, well, Python again executes the bool, done the method bool, for this object 0, for this instance. So it's going to look at the result of 0 not equal to 0, which of course is going to be false. 0 is equal to 0. So this would return false. And so we would get that bool of 0 would be exactly false, right? 0 is falsy. Again, we saw that in the previous slide as one of the exceptions to when objects are falsy. Now we'll cover this and many other special functions in a later video in the course on object-oriented programming, and we'll take a look at all these special functions and we'll actually code them up and actually implement those things ourselves. For now, let's just take a look at some of the examples that we have. So if we take bool of this list, well, this list has a len, done the len method. It's a sequence type, and the length is 3. It's not 0. So the truthiness of 3 is true. So bool of this non-empty list would be true. However, bool of this empty list would be false. Now bool of the none object is false as well. Now if we put those two things together, let's take a look and just do a little aside and look at this code. If mylist, and then execute this code block. What's happening here is that the code block will execute if and only if mylist is both not none and not empty. So this is really equivalent to the following code. If mylist is not done and len of mylist is greater than 0, execute the code block. These two pieces of code do the same thing. So you might ask, well, how is it doing all this in here? Well, we're putting this object inside this if statement. So this expression here, Python knows, needs to be a Boolean result. So it's going to look at the truthiness of my list. It's going to look at the associated truth value of my list. If the associated value is true, it will then execute the code block. If it's false, it won't. So how does it evaluate the truth value of my list? Well, if my list is none, it's going to be false. So this code block will not execute if my list is none. On the other hand, suppose my list is not none, right? That it is a list. It is a real list that's been instantiated or been created. Suppose that the length of the list is 0. In other words, it has no elements. Then bool of that is going to return false. So my list will again be falsy, and therefore this code block will not execute. But if my list is an actual list instance, so it's not none, and if it contains elements also, then it will be truthy, because the len is going to be something other than 0. It's going to be something like this one up here, which means it's going to be true, and therefore the code block will execute. So this and this are actually totally equivalent. All right, so enough of an aside. Let's go back. Let's continue. So if we look at a string ABC, again, that's a sequence type. It has a non-zero character count. It has a length that's greater than 0. That's truthy as well. An empty string, on the other hand, well, 0 elements in the string, 0 elements in the sequence. That's going to be false. Boolean of zeros we've seen before is false. Why? Well, 0 is, the number is 0. That's always going to be false. And it doesn't matter if it's a complex number. If it's 0, that will be false as well. Works the same with decimals. On the other hand, if we have non-zero numbers, even -1, as we saw in the last video, that will be true. Same thing with a non-zero complex number, that will be true. And same thing with a non-zero decimal number, that will be true as well. So let's jump into some code and just take a look at this in action, and I'll see you in a bit.